All right.
Okay.
Technical issue. Sorry, guys.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Ben, and thank you for joining us today. We have our presentation today. Our speakers are Evan Machusak and Ann Smith. And the presentation will be about HEDIS. Sorry if my pronunciation is wrong, on FHIR.
Sure.
That's
The
okay.
floor is yours.
That's the learning objective, to say HEDIS.
What does HEDIS stand for, Ann?
Healthcare Effectiveness Data and Information Set.
I personally don't know that, so I had to ask her.
All right, go ahead.
There we go.
All right, so this is Evan, and he let me pick his title. So that's why it says programmer, because I know all developers hate having them being called programmers. So that's his title for today.
And Ann is an AVP at NCQA.
Next slide. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to start out with setting a general context for what NCQA is doing in the U.S. healthcare system. So just kind of the global, what is the U.S. healthcare system doing with CQL and FHIR, and then how do we fit our what we're doing into that ecosystem. And then Evan's going to spend a little time talking about the tools that we use to create our measures that are on FHIR. And then we'll wrap up, if we have a couple minutes at the end, with the future quality measures, kind of where we're going and where the U.S. is going as well. So NCQA in 30 seconds. NCQA is the National Committee for Quality Assurance. People in the United States don't have a national health care, and I will not give my own personal view on that, but they do need a way to find good health care, and that's where NCQA comes in. We measure performance and try to highlight physicians and health plans that provide high quality care. Next slide. We do this by collecting data from health plans. So HEDIS, Healthcare Effectiveness Data and Information Set, is a set of 100 quality measures that health plans report from across the United States. Many of them report for federal government and state government. So the federal government requires some reporting, the state governments require some reporting for our retirees and for our people that are receiving subsidized health care. And then there are commercial employer health plans that also have to report to receive accreditation from us. Next slide. So all in all, we cover 73% of Americans with our programs. We have 60,000 clinicians that we also recognize. So besides reporting at the health plan level, individual clinicians report as well for different programs. And we have 13,000 entities that we either certify or recognize who are supplemental to the healthcare system. So either things like EHRs or vendors who are producing HEDIS, things like that. So we also recognize those people. So that's us in a snapshot. So where's the United Healthcare System going? The United States healthcare system has been looking at developing a learning health system. So can our healthcare, I think, do what other industries do? Can we learn from our own behavior, from our own research? So you'll see here on this learning health system wheel, there's evidence in the blue circle. The blue portion of the circle. So this is the research. This is all the background that's being done to help determine guidelines and for clinical practice, right? So all of that research builds into a body of knowledge. That knowledge gets put into guidelines and clinical practice guidelines for physicians. Then the physicians take those clinical practice guidelines and clinical decision support and integrate them into their clinical care. So here is the hands-on patient care now. We're using all of that knowledge that we've accumulated to make sure that we're treating the right patient at the right time with the right procedure. Then we come in, oh, no, not yet. We come in with quality improvement and we try to measure. So we have quality measurement. So we come in and we try to measure this. Are physicians doing the right thing at the right time? Are they following the clinical practice guidelines? Then that measurement, with that measurement and those analytics, we report that information out. And then hopefully we affect care. And so the whole circle starts all over again. And the research is being done on that. And hopefully care is being improved. And so the cycle goes. And so the United States has been trying to use make this process more electronic. So this process, it isn't that this process hasn't been going on for years, but it's been very manual. So physicians have manually had to go to paper documents to look up what they should be doing for clinical decision support. They may have been going to research articles, research journals, and saying, okay, I have this patient, what should I be doing? So we're trying to take that manual process and we're trying to automate it. And automating it through the use of FHIR and through the use of CQL. Now you can go. If you were at Bryn's presentation earlier, or I forgot who was just in the main room, but you've seen this slide a couple times if you've been at a couple of these presentations. So this is showing how through that whole process there are different efforts going on. So we're creating different implementation guides for the different pieces of this. We have CQL. We have QI Core as the foundation of what we're doing. CDS hooks, CPGIG, all those things are working together as we try and move the system and make all this process electronic. Next slide. So how do we fit into this? So with HEDIS, we have also been trying to make our clinical quality measures electronic as well. So we've started from the basics, building an IG to help people say what data elements it is that you need to report HEDIS. So we have gone back to US Core and Care and Blue Button. Both of those are mandated in the United States. So health plans have to produce patient resources in US Core, and they have to provide EOBs in Care and Blue Button. So we've gone back to those and we've said, let's start where things are being mandated. We want to move to being able to use QI Core and other things for our quality measures. That's what's being developed for quality measures, but right now we started with where is everybody at? Let's start where they're at and start building on that to get people to move in the direction we want them to go. So we've built our HEDIS IG and our HEDIS requirements from US Core and Care and Blue Button. Next slide. All right, so we have actually been working on digitalizing our HEDIS measures for quite a while. We've started before CQL. We started with QDM, where QDM was both our logic model and our data model. And as the industry has been moving forward, so have we. So we've advanced from using QDM as the data model into using, as the logic model, into using CQL as the logic model. And we've pushed forward into using FHIR. Many of the initiatives in the United States are using QDM, especially the large government initiatives are still using QDM. But we see the impact of being able to use FHIR. QDM, nobody is using QDM in their EHR, nobody is using QDM in any of their systems, a quality data model. And so we wanted to move to a system that is being used interoperably, a system that is, well, may not be native to the EHR, at least people are using it and focusing on it. So we've been trying to drive that effort forward as well, moving our measures forward. We have 23 measures currently that are digital, and Evan's going to show you how we did it.
All right, everybody can hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, excellent. All right, so we're going to start kind of from the beginning when we first began playing with CQL until where we've gotten now, and I'll try to explain why we decided to make our changes as we did. So in the bad old days, the first batch of digital measures we ever really built, at least in FHIR, we started by using our friend Visual Studio Code, which is a little bit ahead of some other folks who preferred Atom. They shall not be named, but they know who they are. And so the original version of our VS Code, for lack of a better word, extension, it really wasn't an extension. It was a series of NPM scripts. So we would write the CQL. We did manage to get somebody, a very talented person who some of you may know, named Brian Irick, who unfortunately now works at MITRE. Terrible loss for them. He integrated the syntax highlighting for us, and that's pretty much all we had. So it was a very manual process. You wrote some CQL, you ran an NPM script, and that was that. So we did this for a couple years, and we really had problems integrating our tests. That was a real problem for us because writing CQL is the easy part. In all these cases, when you see some of the ECQM demos that Bryn likes to include in his slides, they're 2 lines of code. But I might show you some of the ugly stuff in here in our code base that is quite a bit more complicated. So what you're looking at here, this is the COLE HEDIS measure that we put out for 2022. Of course, this is copyrighted, so no screenshots. But anyway, there's no secret sauce here, so it's all right. So when we would try to test this, we'd have to run NPM scripts and all that. So circa, 2 Januaries ago, we started developing a native extension that had more features. This was in response to our many authors. How many people do we have doing CQL at NCQA? 10?
10.
12? 10. Something like that? It's a lot of people. So we built them a custom extension, which I'll show you here. Just a little bit of what it does. I'm not going to demo it entirely because it's somewhat superfluous, but we built out a cute little, it became the horse. And the reason it's a horse is because I needed to find some vector graphic that was sort of measure-y and that would actually show up in VS Code correctly. So I figured, it's a horse, it runs, it does stuff, I don't know. And so, that one little decision, this has henceforth become the horse extension. So it's the horse. And we just added this new pane in here, and we organized the CQL files by identifying them in a directory. So you can see in the directory structure here, we have a folder called CQL. So this extension, when you open it up in a workspace, it says, oh, look at that, we've got CQL files. And we had automatic Elm construction, so you save this file, it will regenerate the Elm, which you can see, which sometimes is useful. For those of you who are unaware, Elm is the intermediate language that CQL sort of compiles into, and so the actual measure is in Elm. CQL is just a human-readable way to create what you're looking at here, this JSON Elm file. You can theoretically create Elm in XML, but no one does. So we also integrated some tests, and I'll show you how we started with tests and where we've gone. So the original tests that we created, you can see, I don't know if it's a little small, but this is an Excel icon. The reason it's an Excel icon is because our first iteration of trying to create tests was through an Excel sheet, which I will show you what that looks like. So this Excel has each row is a test case. We would describe its name, its description, what it was supposed to do. And we had a number of these columns here that described small little FHIR snippets that would be the test data. And then over here on the right, this is a series of columns that looks a lot like FHIR because it sort of is. These are little FHIR snippets in JSON that we would pitch together with macros and a TypeScript file that the infamous Brian from MITRE wrote originally. And so we integrated those into our engine because this was the preferred way of doing tests. Now, of course, for those of you who write code for a living and are looking at this, you might have had the same kind of reaction that I did the first time I saw this, which was, oh no, this is not necessarily the right way to test it. But this is what a group of clinicians and informaticists who don't have the ability to write custom code, who can write CQL, right? They can do this stuff. They can do this. But you ask them to create a unit test suite, and they say, what? What is a unit test? So that is what they put together, and we integrated that with them. But over the years, we evolved to using FHIR, which I will show you an example. I thought I kept it open, but I did not. So we have FHIR tests as well now for many of our measures. And so FHIR is supposed to be used for IG creation. That was kind of its intent. But as part of IGs, you want to create example resources. So when I saw the first FHIR demo at a DevDays last year in Cleveland, I saw what FHIR could do, and I thought, why don't we just create files this way? Why don't we create test patients this way? Because this is very simple compared to that Excel monstrosity I showed you a moment ago. So we taught our CQL developers to use Fish to write tests. And so they're creating patient instances, and they're creating a measure report, which is how they assert what the expectations ought to be. And we created a system inside this extension that will automatically convert the Fish to JSON and then run it through an engine, and then check that the measure report resource matches. So it's very cool. We have several hundred of these Fish files for our various measures at this point, and it's super neat. And one feature of the engine, this extension, which is kind of neat, is that you can theoretically, and I won't do it here live because it doesn't work. I haven't used this in a while. So, but what we do have the ability to do is we do have the ability to run these tests on multiple engines. So we have an Excel test on the NCQA engine, which is now officially the FHIR CQL SDK, by the way. So if you're interested in that, I'm talking on Friday about that. But we also run on the reference engine, which is the MITRE engine. Now, the reason we have to have both is because this extension is still being used by our contract work, which is required to use the reference engine because these contract measures must be loaded into the CMS tooling. So what are they called? Maddie, Bonnie, those things, Maddie, yeah, those guys. So they still use this, and they have to make sure that these tests run on the reference engine. You might ask why you would have both, why not just one? It's because that CQL can behave subtly differently on different engines at the moment. That's a problem we're trying to address this year, but at the moment, there is some disparity between how engines behave. So since by contract we must load it into Maddie, we want to make sure that we're developing everything for Maddie. So that is how that works. So we have two different engines integrated into this extension, but that was last year, at least when it comes to HEDIS. We used to do this for HEDIS as well, but we have since evolved a little bit more because as our CQL programmers have grown, several of them have said, I want to learn how to use other languages. Is there a better way to do this? And they also wanted to use the NCQA engine, henceforth the FHIR CQL SDK, more to its full extent. And I'll show you that quickly here. I will go more into what I'm about to show you on Friday, so I'm not going to go super deep. So if you're interested in how all of this works under the hood, then come to my Friday session. But now we use full-blown Visual Studio for HEDIS. And so the way it works, generally speaking, is we include CQL files in a Visual Studio project called CQL. And we have essentially hijacked the build system. It's not really hijacking, it's just extending it the way it's meant to be extended. And what it does, this project, where we have all our CQL files, when you build this project, it will take these CQL files and it will turn them into Elm for you. And it uses the standard CQL to Elm tooling, the reference tooling that you're all familiar with. It's the only converter that currently exists.
Okay, just a little bit. There you go.
And here I thought I was your assistant. You're starting to make me question that. All right. So it builds these CQL files into a little second project we have called build artifacts, and build artifacts contains all the actual JSON. These files are not actually committed to our GitHub repository where the CQL are. These are generated, so we don't actually commit these. But the build artifact project builds this, which is our measures project. And so what the FHIR CQL SDK will do for you is it will enable you, if you like, you don't have to use it this way, but it's an option. You can create C# files out of CQL. It's technically out of Elm, but for all intents and purposes. So let me see if I can open up COLE. Not that it really matters all that much. So we create C# classes. The benefit of doing this is that we have two capabilities that the existing extension did not give us. The first is, let me scroll down here to an actual definition. These are all just boring. But for a real definition like the initial population value, the translation that we do breaks it up into statements, and this is intentional because it makes it easy to put breakpoints where we want them to be. So if we need to figure out that, if we suspect that the element is not in the interval and we want to see why, we can put a breakpoint here, run a specific patient, and step-by-step debug this. If initial population age range turns out to be wrong, we can drag the arrow up and step into this function. We have access to all of Visual Studio's pros and cons, most of which are pros. We have immediate windows, we have quick watch, we have all the great stuff that makes Visual Studio one of the best IDEs on the planet. And this is how we now operationalize authoring of measures, and that is partly because it gives us access to the ability to write unit tests in a framework that we all know and love. So this is MS test. We could have used XUnit, but regardless, we have many, many hundreds. I think we have about 2,000 at this point, tests that are written entirely in C#. So this is a continuous enrollment test that we've put together where we create the coverage natively, just using FHIR objects, create periods, and we can just call a CQL function as though it were a native .NET function, and this enables us to assert correctness. And we further integrated this into our Azure DevOps system, which I'll show you briefly here. This pipeline was just started this morning. So what this pipeline does for us is it compiles all of this, so it just builds the Visual Studio solution I just showed you. It runs the unit tests, and then each one of our measures that we've currently converted, we have a task that will run a measure certification test deck, which, if those of you who are familiar with HEDIS, you'll know what certification is, but we use those test decks, which we've converted to FHIR, to make sure that these CQL measures are certified. I'm putting air quotes in here because there's a caveat, so if you're curious about what that caveat is, you can come talk to Kenji or I later on. But this ensures that the CQL is nominally correct. And these test decks contain anywhere between 10 and about 150,000 patients, depending on the measure. Some measures are very simple, some are very more complicated. And sometimes you'd think that some of the more, the measures that have 50 numerators would be more complicated, but actually CIS, which is childhood immunization status, actually has one of the fewest numbers of patients, actually. So you can kind of tell this by how long each one of these takes. This is generally speaking based on how large the deck is. So what this does is once the test passes, and we know it passed the cert deck, we package it according to packaging. If you attended Bryn's talk earlier, you saw how he talked about packaging these into executable libraries. So we package those into these FHIR resources, so each one of these measures has its own library resource and a measure resource as well. And when we're done with this, we actually deploy this directly into a QA environment for software that Kenji is designing and building. So if you're curious about that software, talk to Kenji. So this is a completely integrated pipeline system, and this particular set of measures does not integrate directly to some of our other programs, but Anne alluded to some of our recognition programs that work with clinicians. We have a diabetes recognition program, and we use this technology to directly integrate a CQL diabetes measure directly into a web application. So now when customers upload data, which can be in FHIR, we can directly execute a measure inside of a legacy application that we wrote in 2015. So it's pretty cool, and this is where we are now. There's a lot more in the future, which I will go more into on Friday, but that is the quick overview of the evolution of our tooling history, and this is how we now execute and author measures. So there's a couple other aspects to our ecosystem that I want to mention just quickly. The first is that we have a IG that Anne alluded to. We are using Simplifier to operationalize this. We evaluated a number of different mechanisms, one of which was just using fish for the way it's in theory intended to work, which is to make IGs. But this IG is very large. We have lots of profiles potentially. It isn't actually a lot of changes, but each one has at least one change. So therefore we have to have profiles on virtually every resource. And so Simplifier made this so much easier for us. It allows me to not have to spend a lot of time getting the people who are building this to learn how to use fish IG tooling and all that, because they're not developers, right? They're knowledge engineers, former clinicians, those types of people. So I'm just showing you on the screen, this is the claim profile that we have. Claim is something that US Core and neither Karen nor US Core profile at the moment, I believe. There might be a US Core claim, is there? I didn't think so.
Not now.
Yeah.
No.
But we obviously use claims because HEDIS is a payer data set. It's designed for payers. So one of the examples that we put on everything is, for those of you who are familiar with HEDIS, HEDIS cares deeply about the data source from which the data came. Some measures we only allow administrative numerator hits. So that means you have to identify an event in an administrative claim or an EOB or something like that, whereas other events can be identified with supplemental data, which is I would say clinical data, but it's not just clinical. It's basically depending on what your HEDIS auditor says you're allowed to have. So all of our resources require some type of information about what data source this came from. And so Simplifier makes it very easy to publish these as well. So this is what a published IG will look like. I just want to point out real quick that, as you can see, this is version 0.2. This is an early alpha. And if you're interested in getting access to this so you can comment on it, email Anne.
Thanks.
My assistant,
email me.
Anne-Marie Smith. You can email her, and she can hook you up, and we can talk about getting access to this so you can see what we're thinking about. Generally speaking, our IG is almost barely more than US Core is, for example. I'm showing patient because this is the one example I always give. We need birth date. US Core does not require it, but obviously for a breast cancer screening, which requires you to be 52 to 74, if we don't have your birth date, we don't have anything. So we have to have that. So we increase the cardinality to 1. So, and the reason for that actually is quality measurement's really tough when it comes to missing data, because if we didn't require birth date, then you could give us a patient that doesn't have one, and we would then compute you as uncertain. And uncertainty is really dicey in quality measurement, because HEDIS might tell you, well, if you're uncertain, then you're not in the numerator. You have to be definitively in the numerator. But when you're implementing it, it's not as clear. So in CQL, you'll just get a big fat null, right? So what does null mean? It means we don't know. And so that is very dicey. So we're trying to make the IG as much of a front door as we possibly can. So we're going to try to use this to validate all resources before we even execute a measure, because in a lot of cases, it's better not to actually execute the patient at all if you're going to have a bunch of uncertainty. It's better to say, we can't compute these patients. Please fix them before you run them through, because it can have an adverse effect on your rates. And because HEDIS feeds into CMS stars, among other things, there's a lot of money on the table if your rates are bad. CVS, for example, had to downgrade their revenue expectations because of 1 star, 1/2 of 1 star. So it makes a big difference. So the IG is extremely important. The other thing I want to show you, I mentioned a couple times TestX. The TestX system that we use was written in 1998. It was one of Anne's first projects at NCQA.
1999.
I know, I'm coming dangerously close to aging her, but it's been around for a long, long time. And I can tell you,
1999 it was written.
1999. I have Perl scripts in source control that are dated to 1998, so it's before that time. But anyway, so we are currently working to update that to Synthea. So this is a version of Module Builder that we have hosted internally in NCQA. We've found the need to, I just zoomed in accidentally, but we have a need to add some things to Synthea. For example, this concept of, let me see how I can zoom out a little bit. Well, it's not that important. Synthea will generate these patients, and when this transition happens, when this SNOMED code is added to the record, we want to declare that this means that this patient would be a numerator hit. This is essentially how the original system works, but it predates Synthea by a decade and a half and is currently based in x86 version of Visio that we can't install on modern laptops, so the laptops that we have that run it are like precious. They're not allowed to travel with them. They have to stay in the office. It's crazy stuff. So we're upgrading that. So this means that starting hopefully next year, we're going to pilot it next year, we should start doing all of our certification natively in FHIR. And I'm hoping to be able to integrate this more into our CQL testing so that certification modules generate all of our test data for us live as part of this integration. But anyway, so Anne, you want to talk more about the future of stuff?
Yep.
Okay.
So I'll wrap up with just, actually maybe the next slide. Evan went through a lot of our challenges and lessons learned, but where are we going in the future? So CMS, who hosts most of our federal and state enrollees, they have decided that there's too many quality measures out there, that there's too much burden in the system for quality measures. So they have committed to coming up with a universal foundation of measures that they will use in their programs so that they can narrow down the number of measures that are out there. Like I said, our HEDIS volume, I don't know if you caught it at the beginning, has 100 measures in it. For CMS programs, just for their ECQMs, we've got over 40 clinician measures, 10 hospital measures, so now there's that's 150 measures out in the world. And if you go to the CMS claims measures, there's over 200, so now we got 350 out there in the world. So you can see that a physician who is enrolled in multiple programs and is trying to track multiple measures across multiple systems, and it gets a little complicated. So that's why CMS has gone to this universal foundation of measures. And actually, I didn't highlight them on here. I probably should have. And reading them all is like, don't worry about it. It's small print. But a lot of the measures on here are actually measures that are developed by NCQA. So we are also looking at our measurement sets and how can we simplify them and follow CMS's lead to reduce burden in the system. And more importantly, with CQL, can we make the measures the same across different parts of the system? I have personally seen EHRs that have screens that have like 10 or 12 different breast cancer screening measures on them, which you say, why would you need that? Because breast cancer screening is easy, 52 to 75, mammogram every 2 years. But depending on the time period that the measure is calculated in, and if there is continuous enrollment at the health plan level versus if you need visits at the physician level, you end up with different populations. And so physicians are trying to track the same measure across different programs. And so it gets really complicated then for them to know what their actual rate is. So next slide. And then along with this, as we are developing our measures, one thing Evan didn't show is that we are slicing and dicing our code a little differently so that we can inform other use cases. So we know that physicians are out there using the measures to do things like closing gaps in care, or using them in their own performance improvement plans, or they're starting to be used in value-based care contracting, so people are getting paid on them. So making sure that our measures work across all of these different use cases. That's one of the things that we're really working on and trying to make our measures a little more flexible. So that's kind of the future of where we're going.
I can show you real quick what Ann was mentioning here about how I didn't show you something. I'll just point it out quickly here. Well, if you think it's interesting, I'll show it. We emphasize when we develop CQL, we really emphasize the use of libraries. Now, most examples you see do this as well, but we've taken it to a fairly deep level. So we kind of break up our thinking in terms of libraries on, is this a function that is specific to a resource? So for example, we have functions and conditions that, for example, can extract, wrong focus. We can extract an onset date from an onset property in a condition. You can see in this case statement, onset can be many different things. So normalizing to a single date is often useful. Same with abatement and all that. So these are things that are not topical to any particular condition or a medical concept. They're just helper functions for resources. So we have quite a few of those. And then on top of that, we have topical measures, or libraries rather, that are based on essentially clinical concepts. So we have an entire library related to cancer, so your breast cancer screening stuff would be located in the cancer library. We have things about kidneys, which some of the diabetes measures are there. We have metabolic measures, which also are diabetic type concepts. For those of you who know HEDIS, advanced illness and frailty is an exclusion that is almost universal across all of our measures, so naturally we put that all in the library. And then on top of that, we have some measures where things like AAB and CWP are two measures that are both related to antibiotics, and it turns out that their numerators are almost identical. So we have functions in these libraries that will simplify that. So both of them use this, and so we try very hard to turn all these things into libraries. And one of the strengths of this content that we're developing is that these libraries theoretically are reusable. They're not just for these HEDIS measures. but they're also extensively tested. And I think that's the thing that really should be a takeaway for what our content does for you. If you want to develop a new measure that is based on cancer, any kind of cancer, we have helper functions to deal with that kind of stuff. And because we use these in so many of our measures, they're very well tested. We know these functions work correctly. So that's what Anne meant when she said we break our stuff apart so it can be reusable.
Yep. That's
All right.
it. I think we're up to questions.
Yeah, I think we're up to questions at this point, which I'm sure there are dozens.
Linnell James, Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. Evan, when you mentioned the issue of claims being available in U.S. core versus claims actually being built in the blue button, I was wondering
Right.
why.
Well, so,
Hello?
Okay. Okay. So let me restate the question. It's about the issue of you asked about claims in FHIR, and claims in FHIR are actually in the blue button. I was wondering
Right.
why you were looking for them in U.S. core when they were built in blue button.
EOB was built into Blue Button, so we actually put in both of our measures, EOBs and claims. Our measures use pending claims, so there may not be an EOB generated. So the way we've written them now is we're looking for a particular event to happen either in claims or EOB or clinical if it's appropriate.
Yeah, and that's not
Yeah.
right. And claim and EOB as resources, I think both of them are only maturity level 2, and they are very complicated compared to a lot of other resources, and they also have a lot of overlapping data in them. So you can take an EOB profile and just look at the parts that are also in the claim, and you can apply the same kind of rules that Karen did for EOBs. We pretty much just lifted and shifted those into claims. So the code for writing claims checks and EOB checks is almost identical, and so therefore our IG is also.
Thanks for that great presentation, guys. So with I would expect that I'm just given the really super wide applicability of your guys' measures, those HEDIS profiles that you're kind of in the process of developing, it seemed like they will be a de facto requirement across the industry when once we see all of quality measures in FHIR. And then if you look at the different base set of profiles, we're looking we have US Core, if you guys said Karen Blue Button, which is a different data set, the DaVinci specs, then the QI Core. Have you considered balloting those as part of an HL7 project in order to just kind of get industry buy-in on what those profiles look like and contain and how they relate to others?
That's a good question. Amal, do you want to answer this question? Amal is our head of interop, and he happens to be in the audience. So this is really his domain.
So, hey, so that's a great question. And I think we're looking at that possibility in terms of working with the community to perhaps establish some sort of a process. And it could be HL7 balloting, or it could be some other form of certification. I don't want to use the word certification, but some sort of a consensus-based, community-based process. So we are looking at all options. The idea there is that we want to use interoperability, the reality of interoperability in the market right now. In the sense, we want to use the regulated APIs, the standards that are being used in the regulated APIs of today and not tomorrow. And so in that spirit, we are ready to work with industry stakeholders and come up with something that's reasonable.
Thank you, Amal. Remember, I'm just a programmer / executive assistant to Anne-Marie Smith, so Amal makes the calls.
And I think I can say, and Amal can yell at me if I'm wrong, but I think our long-term goal would be to merge with and use QI Core and things like that, but we wanted to start where the industry is right now. We know the industry doesn't have QI Core programmed.
And we are talking to groups like ONC to talk about what needs to be in future versions of US CDI to support this. We would prefer not to need an IG, but at the moment we do.
100% agree with that. In fact, I would love to kind of do a call to action to the community here and at large to come together to basically create a roadmap, a US CDI roadmap from a quality perspective. Make sure that the elements that are relevant to quality, they get included as part of the US CDI roadmap, because that to me is the real game changer in terms of bringing interoperability to the quality domain.
Thank you for the presentation. So my question, the proliferation of quality measures, I think, is a universal problem. It's not just the US. And I'm not quite sure if you understand the universal model that the CMS is now proposing. Is it your intent to bring down the 350 measures to 100 or whatever by merging them, or what is the strategy there?
They're not all ours, so we can't do everything, but we are taking a look at our measurement set. That's one of the things we're doing over the next couple of years, and we're trying to focus on the right measures for the right patients at the right time. So really looking at what do we need to be measuring, what is there good science around, what can we measure effectively, and to bring in more patient-centered outcomes. So can we focus on patient goals? Can we focus on patient satisfaction in our measures rather than just kind of general measures? Right now, because our measures are based on claims, there is quite a few of them that are not as specific as we would like, or are using proxies. So if anybody knows our blood pressure measure, right now we're looking to see if blood pressure is controlled by looking at the last blood pressure of the year, which obviously is not the best way to know if your blood pressure is under control. It's a one-time reading, something could have been going on, right? So we're starting to look at these measures and say, are they really good measures? Are they measuring the right thing? Retiring measures that are not, I don't want to say not good, but not measuring the right thing.
Well, and also healthcare quality is a moving target, right?
Yeah.
So what was important 15 years ago may not be as important today because health systems have moved past needing to be measured on that because everybody's doing it well. So that's rarer than it should be, unfortunately, but that's the case. I think when you listen to Bryn's presentations about CQL and you hear people talk about quality measurement, you almost always see the ECQM versions of measures because, first of all, they're public because they're CMS products, so they're open source, but also because they're much simpler. So HEDIS measures that have to look for an encounter, a claim, and an EOB, and then we have to deduplicate those by date because you can't count those as 3 events and so on because they all happen on the same time. Because anytime you go to the doctor, they're going to create a claim, and that claim is going to ultimately turn into an EOB. So when you start having to write that kind of logic, it gets messy. So ECQMs are much prettier to show. One of the challenges that we have because of this whole data source conundrum where our measures are designed to be claims and administrative data and the ECQMs are designed to be hospital measures that run on EHR outputs, one of the strategic things that NCQA is looking to do, and we have tacit plans to do this, though it has to go through various committees because it's an industry buy-in thing, is to follow the DQM model that CMS is pushing and eliminate these requirements around, well, this has to be from an administrative data source and this has to be from here. We want to get to the point where it can be from any data source, and that would eliminate the need for there to be a strong distinction between this is an ECQM and this is the HEDIS measure. Because breast cancer screening is ultimately based on one clinical practice guideline, so why can't the code be the same? That's a discussion that you will hear multiple times, and a lot of times people will give you a cynical take on HEDIS, which is to say, it's just the ECQM plus you have to check continuous enrollment, which is an oversimplification, but it's not that far off. So in the future, we should have to only have one, and we're working towards that goal, but it will take some time because, as this gentleman mentioned, it's a wide-reaching set of measures that all health plans have to deal with, so we can't make quick changes without buy-in, so it will take some time to get there.
Well, with that, we have one more question from the Hoover. There's quite a bit, but I'll pick one. What is the roadmap to convert all the traditional measures into digital measure?
You mean the paper-based HEDIS measures?
Yeah.
Is that, I assume that's what they
CQL.
mean?
That's what they mean,
End
yeah.
of year, we should get to. Whether we release them this end of the year or whether we wait until next March, I'm not sure when the release date will be, but we are aggressively converting them to CQL. So we should have all, or I'll say all with an asterisk because there are some measures that nobody does electronically at the moment because they involve data sources that are not well captured. Things like CAPS measures and some of the other survey measures, they're not conducted the way the rest of them are, so we might shelve those this year, but we'll see. All the major heavy hitters should be done this year.
Thank you so much. With that, thank you, Evan and Ann, for the wonderful presentation today.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
If there's more questions in the
Yeah, we'll stick around.
maybe you can follow up later.
Yeah, let's see.
Yeah, we can log in and check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so stop sharing. I guess I'll leave this on until something comes. All right.
I don't know how to take it off.